Joining us for this segment is Rich Rubino. He is a columnist with the Huffington Post and also a political author. Again, with us is Tom Farmer, formerly with CNN. Gentlemen, let's move on to this situation with ICANN, the Internet Corporation for Assigned Names and Numbers. Very little reported about this issue. The control of that internet would go from the Department of Commerce to an international body. Tom, why is this story so significant?
Well, hang on. ICANN has been in the business of managing Internet protocols and assigning sort of tiers of addresses and so forth in the same way that the FCC assigns frequencies for 20 years or more since the Internet became a consumer phenomenon. It's important because ICANN has until now kept Internet traffic running through principally through United States-based hardware facilities, server facilities. Network lines tend to run through the States. In the wake of the NSA revelations, you're seeing more and more countries express an interest in bypassing U.S. network facilities and running their own lines. So Brazil and Germany, for example, want to run a cable across the Atlantic Ocean that cuts the U.S. out of the mix, which would maybe inhibit the NSA's ability to surveil a little bit. And you're seeing more and more of this. So now ICANN is morphing towards international, decentralized control of the Internet. Naysayers say this is terrible because it's a sign of diminishing U.S. influence, and it may assign control to people who don't really deserve it or might do us harm. And people who think this is a good idea think the Internet is a global phenomenon anyway, and no one country should have too much power. I tend to think it's not as harmful as people say, but it is important. And it would be getting more coverage over the last 10 days if this missing 777 weren't dominating every airwave in Christendom.
We'll talk about that in a little bit. But first, one of the questions this raises for me is if more countries have more say, would countries like China that want to put more regulations on the Internet, would that give them power, Rich?
Yeah, I don't know. It's an interesting phenomenon. It's almost kind of like the wild, wild west, I guess, in terms of whether it's China or I guess you could say a country like North Korea, which completely shuts everything out. I don't know what exactly would happen here, and I don't know also, but I do think that the U.S. obviously has a lot of control right now on the Internet. Just type in, just about anything, and it's either a U.S. site or it's a British site. It's amazing how hard it is to get some sort of a site, whether it's in a foreign language or to get a site that's just not American. It's amazing how much not America and the West in general just control this device, and as it's the medium of our age. What the medium will be in the next 20 years or so, I don't know, but right now I think it's a medium, and in terms of politicians, they've sort of already harnessing it for to make money, to raise money. Basically, I think we saw that with Jesse Ventura, then Howard Dean kind of piggybacked on that.
So, a good idea or a bad idea, Tom Farmer?
Yeah, it's a good idea. I share the concern that maybe China will have a seat at a table when China's motives aren't always the purest. But it's a worse situation, I think, to have the entire planet feel that they are enthralled to U.S. standards, U.S. Priorities, and make the Internet U.S.-centric, which it clearly, is not. We're, 8% of the population? We can't be 90% of the Internet, so it's inevitable.
Rich, good idea or bad idea?
Yeah, no, I basically agree, and I think that it would also just culturally, it would be a lot more interesting for the Internet user in the U.S. to see that there is a world outside of the continuous United States as well.
Okay, let's move on to Malaysia Flight 370 has been, as you mentioned, Tom, a forefront of the every coverage. CNN, of course, doing wall-to-wall coverage, your old home. So what do you make of it? It's been so interesting. Even some members of Congress have been making bets or guessing really at this point as to what happened to Malaysia Flight 370. Tom, what are your instincts telling you?
Well, my instincts are that Occam's razor says the most obvious theory tends to be the accurate one, and the plane ran out of fuel and crashed into the ocean someplace. These elaborate conspiracy theories about how it's in a cave in Pakistan, or it's being loaded with A-bombs and going to be flown into the Houses of Parliament are insane. The coverage has been almost insane, because they're so thin on facts and things to talk about. They have to speculate 24/7. CNN did not distinguish itself the other day by speculating about black holes in the Bermuda Triangle and whether aliens played a role here and this kind of thing. But I will say this. If there's one clear trend in the information arc over the last 12 days or so, it's that we keep finding out stuff which you should have known days ago, but one intelligence service or another decided it wasn't worth sharing, or they weren't going to share it in a timely way. And that's true from one country after another. If you don't think there is not somebody in the U.S. intelligence community at Fort Meade or Langley that knows exactly what happened here, but cannot reveal because it would reveal our surveillance capability, I got a bridge to sell you. We have an NSA that can listen to every phone call you ever made and scrutinize your grocery tapes from Safeway for the last 5 years. You think they can't find a 300-ton aircraft? Of course they can. They know where it is. They're not going to begin to share it. They're going to give the Malaysians the initiative, and we're going to find the thing at the bottom of the Indian Ocean at some point, maybe tomorrow, maybe 2 weeks from now.
Rich, what are your...
keep talking on CNN until then, I don't know. But that's the story.
Yeah, that's what keeps the 24-hour cable news industry in business, I guess. I think it really started, around the Persian Gulf War and then the O.J. Simpson trial. But there's always seems to be one story that the stations just have a certain fascination with, and they can always go back to it, even though they're really saying very little. Everything is basically speculation. I tend to agree with the supposition that it probably was not a terrorist. That it was not terrorist inspired. It was probably simply ran out of fuel, or something happened, or it drowned. But I don't know. I'm doing the same thing that everyone else is doing, which is essentially just speculation. That's all it is. And then until anybody finds out exactly what happened, as you say, the U.S. government, whether they have some information on this or not, we really don't know. And that's basically, I can save their time for anyone who's going to watch any coverage of it. That's basically the answer. We don't know.
Hey, are there any lessons from your standpoint, from any of the information that we're getting about the hours the pilots put in, about the fuel situation, about the data that was in the black box? Is there anything that we can learn or do differently here in the United States? Anything jump out at you guys?
There may be in the future, once we know what went on. We don't know what's in the black box yet. We presume that a cockpit breach would have been very difficult. There's nothing to suggest the pilots were fatigued or were flying long hours or were in league with each other. They didn't ask to be paired together on this trip. There's such a paucity of data here that you run around pretty quickly and start talking about airplanes you were on 10 years ago that kind of looked like this one. And that's been the quality of cable coverage over the last 10 years. And parenthetically, I have flown on those Malaysian 777s. They've only got 12 or 15 of them. And I've been on those flights across Asia and down to Western Australia. And they seem perfectly safe to me. But that, I think probably everybody who has an eventful flight doesn't expect it. The fact is that this is as big an insoluble in aviation mystery as we're going to get, and it's made worse, I think, in the 21st century by the fact that we fancy ourselves 5 seconds away from finding anything out in the world that we want to know. We're a Google-centric population. Where all the trivia you need is right at your fingertips. The fact that we can't figure this out in record speed is driving people crazy. Yeah. And it has become the principal bar talk across the civilized world. If you sit down in any bar in the country right now and say, so where do you think it is? People know what you're talking about, and they got a response.
Yeah, and so do and every conspiracy theorist too. They're having a field day with this. But I will say this about air travel: air travel is extremely safe, but because obviously there's a disproportionate amount of coverage when people do die based on air travel versus, say, for example, people who die as a result of drunk driving. So as a result, we saw this after September 11th. People will fear flying. They'll fear going on airplanes, when in reality, a lot of the things that they're doing while they're fearing is a lot more dangerous than actually going on the airplane. But as they say, there's so much coverage of it. I'm just glad that unlike political campaigns, that airlines don't run negative attack ads. Imagine if they did that, nobody would fly. Imagine if they said, Delta, this many.
Okay.
I'm glad negative attack ads are spirited only to politics right now.
All right, let's move on, because go ahead, Tom. Go ahead.
Last point to make is that when an airplane goes down in this country, which doesn't happen very often, it is a sad and seismic event, but it is not a blow to national pride. In Malaysia, this is. The Malaysian airline is the principal way the country advertises itself in Heathrow Airport and at Los Angeles International and around the world. The airline is the brand ambassador for the country. And for a terrible thing like this to happen and strike at the heart of their competence injures the national psyche in a way that even 9/11 did not damage the airline brands in this country.
Wow, interesting point. Okay, now let's move on to another topic, again, a little bit underreported. Senator Rand Paul receives a warm welcome, of all places, at University of California, Berkeley, Tom?
Yeah, I think this is for Rich, actually, because this whole thing is proof positive of Rich's thesis about, the far right and the far left coming around to meet you in the back garden.
Wow.
Rich, pretty amazing spectacle, no?
Rich?
Yeah, that's exactly what it is. I think Rand Paul is trying to make himself a lot more into a Republican than his father Rand Paul is, and his father Ron Paul, who I think was a libertarian who was kind of running in the Republican primary. Rand Paul is trying to be at least as establishment Republican as he has to be, but this is very interesting. What Rand Paul has been doing, and I think this is to try to show his gravitas in the primaries, that he can actually garner votes from outside the traditional Republican Party. He's actually going to places where he's actually going to places which are not necessarily hospitable toward Republicans. This reminds me of, for example,
not
Ron
necessarily.
Paul
Not necessarily hostile to
yes,
Republicans.
Yes, but it's like when Ron Paul ran. Not only did he appeal to some on the Christian right, some homeschoolers, but he also had his people handing out flyers at Ozfest. I mean, that's about as disparate as you can possibly get, from Ozzy Osbourne fans on the left to homeschoolers on the right. And this is that thesis about the left and the right kind of amalgamating and coming together. There's a lot that Rand Paul says that appeals to the left wing of the Democratic Party, many of whom are disenchanted with the Obama administration, the Obama-Hillary Clinton administration. Mm-hmm. I guess you could say that because Hillary will be essentially, if she's the nominee, she will essentially be Barack Obama's almost stand-in. People will view her as Barack Obama as the establishment candidate, or Joe Biden as the establishment candidate. Rand Paul can potentially garner a lot of votes from both her left and from her right. Now, the issue in the general election is going to be: is he Republican enough? Because we saw with his father. His father could get the libertarian votes. He did well. He did very well with independents, specifically in the New Hampshire primary. But he was not able to get enough Republican votes. And you see Rand Paul, for example, supporting some sanctions on Iran, supporting some sanctions on Russia. He's trying to propitiate himself with the establishment of the Republican Party just enough to get their support, so that he can win in certain states that have closed primaries. But I think a lot of independents you will see crossing over for Rand Paul. But I will say that some of his statements in terms of, for example, talking about the Monica Lewinsky issue with Bill Clinton, I don't see where that necessarily helps, but other than perhaps some in the far right of the Republican Party right now. But he's going to be a very interesting candidate, because he's not necessarily going to play into the traditional political boundaries.
Tom?
The thing about Paul is you got to take the whole guy. He got a standing O at Berkeley for his stance on NSA and government intrusion, and the far left is heartbroken over Obama's failures on civil rights and personal privacy and questions like that. And this plays right into their wheelhouse. And if they could just have that little slice of the Rand Paul pie, I'm sure that would be fine. And yeah, he is proving theoretically he can reach out to people outside the Republican Party, which they have to do or they lose. But you have to take the social conservative stuff. You have to take the lack of sympathy for social spending and the extreme focus on balanced budget politics and the kinds of things which typically drive nations further into recession, not out of them. So, this whole thing is going to mushroom over the next year or so. It makes an interesting story, but those same people who were screaming his name at Berkeley a day or two ago are unlikely to think he's a bronze god when they survey the entire Rand Paul catalog of positions.
I'm trying to picture any Democrat right now who could go to Brigham Young University and get a standing ovation, and I can't really picture one. Joe Lieberman's no longer a Democrat, so he'd be maybe Zell Miller. I don't know. But no, it is very interesting, and my prediction in terms of Rand Paul is that he's now going to make a speech, I think, on poverty, and my prediction is that he will make a speech on how you can basically attenuate the poverty problem using conservative means. For example, he was talking about the tax-free zones that he was using in Detroit, but I think he's going to try to do that. It's very similar to what Bill Clinton did in '92 when he talked about ending welfare as we know it, kind of going the right wing's turf. I think he's going to try. I don't think he wants to be perceived in this necessarily the Republican who kind of this stingy, austere Republican. He just wants to say, I want to solve the poverty problem. I think is what he's saying, but I want to do it with conservative means, and I think that's kind of I think that's his message. You see Governor Sam Brownback from Kansas, for example, is saying very similar things. He's talking about how it's our mission to solve poverty, but he's saying how we need to do it by tax cuts, by conservative means as well. I think that's how Rand Paul's going to handle that.
It's a great point. If he can run the Bill Clinton DLC play from the other side of the playing field and triangulate that way, that would be potentially very intriguing to watch.
Okay.
Dick Morris would be proud.
All right, final segment. What are we missing? What are we not talking about? Rich Rubino, you got 45 seconds. Let's see if you can keep it.
I'll try. All right. Remember Christine O'Donnell in Delaware? Remember that Delaware, Mike Castle, the establishment Republican, was supposed to be a cakewalk. Then he lost in the primary. Christine O'Donnell ran, and then essentially Chris Coons, the Democrat, won. Well, watch the state of Mississippi this time around, because Thad Cochran, who's been in there since 1979, he is a very vociferous challenger on the right in terms of the Tea Party right. If he gets a nomination, the Democrats have actually recruited perhaps the one Democrat who could actually win. Who could actually win a general election, Travis Childers. He's the best Democrat. He's a former congressman. He's represented a district that went 62% for John McCain in 2008 when he was in the Congress, for example. If they nominate a Tea Party candidate and he can get enough moderate support in terms of some of the Thad Cochran supporters, Mississippi could very possibly, I would predict, be this year's Delaware. But then again, if Thad Cochran does win the nomination, then I would say there's very little chance and Childers might want to become a radio talk show host or something. But it's one to watch. It's one to watch.
Tom Farmer.
Here's something that should be getting more attention, but isn't because of the Malaysian Airlines thing. Ambassador Bob Strauss has died at the age of 95. Consummate Washington fixer, worked both sides of the aisle, brought the Democratic Party back from the dead in 1976 after the McGovern debacle, took care of Carter's campaign in 76 and 80, went on to advise Reagan and Bush. It was Nancy Reagan who turned to Bob Strauss to tell President Reagan that the White House was falling apart over Iran-Contra.
Yeah.
It was Bush 41 who sent Strauss to Moscow as his ambassador. And we could use a guy like that now, couldn't we? Who has a bipartisan productivity is considered heretical and obscene. Strauss is revered as he should be as a very, very productive public servant, but if he were to happen on the scene today in the full flush of youth, they would crucify him with big steel spikes for failing one purity test or another. So It's a terrible shame and a terrible referendum on our current politics.
Just want to say my favorite quote from Bob Strauss was when he said that every politician wants you to believe that he was born in a log cabin that he built himself.
All right, gentlemen. Great segments on this week's Politics is Sexy. Rich Rubino, Tom Farmer, thank you very much. And thank you for watching, everyone. Make sure you check us out on Facebook. Until then, see you for another edition of Politics is Sexy. Good night, gentlemen.